This is a review of Christina Hoff Sommers' 1994 book, Who Stole Feminism? How Women Betrayed Women. It's going to be a review and a summary, chapter by chapter summary. Now, Christina Hoff Sommers is an equity feminist, and by that she means that she distinguishes herself from the gender feminists. The gender feminists are the ones who are basically the horrible ones, the ones who want the government to intervene, the ones who believe in patriarchy theory, etc. So I'm going to be going through this right now. In chapter 1, actually in the introduction, she talks about how feminists, gender feminists in particular, use false statistics such as domestic violence, stats which are now accepted in the mainstream of society, such as the Super Bowl domestic violence statistic, which has no basis in reality. In chapter 1, she points out that initially feminism had noble intentions, that of egalitarianism, and she blames the corruption on cultural Marxism, such as the Frankfurt School. And she says that some of the things that these gender feminists, they see patriarchy and oppression absolutely everywhere. And some of the things, the quotes that she gives are quite hilarious. One of the feminists say this: It is a fine spring day, and with an utter lack of self-consciousness I am bouncing down the street. Suddenly catcalls and whistles fill the air. The noises are clearly sexual in intent, and they are meant for me. They come from across the street. I freeze. As Sartre would say, I have been petrified by the gaze of the other. My face flushes, and my motions become stiff and self-conscious. The body which only a moment before I inhabited with such ease now floods my consciousness. I have been made into an object, blissfully unaware, breast bouncing, eyes on the birds in the trees. I could have passed by without having been turned into stone, but I must be made to know that I am, quote, a nice piece of ass. I must be made to see myself as they see me. There is an element of compulsion in this being made to be aware of one's own flesh, like being made to apologize. It is humiliating. What I describe seems less spontaneous, expressions of a healthy eroticism than a ritual of subjugation. So, absolutely bonkers. Anyway, she says that now feminism is all about indoctrination and talking about phallocentric symbols. She ends that in 1991 there was a conference between American gender feminists and Russian feminists, the latter of which warned of the perils of feminism and communism, pointing out how it had taken away the femininity and the delinquency with it. This was seen as heresy by the gender feminists. So perhaps things have to get really bad before the message gets through, because this didn't stop Russian women from divorcing their husbands in droves under Lenin. Just a little thought. Anyway, chapter 2, in this chapter she talks about the victim mentality in the feminists. That is, they read a news report of a male-female crime and then generalize it to the whole population, such as rape. But it also creates, and she doesn't say it directly, but a sort of inferiority complex. This is a really good quote I picked out. The new feminists are a powerful source of mischief because their leaders are not good at seeing things as they are. Resented feminists like Faludi, French, and McKinnon speak of a backlash, siege, and an undeclared war against women. But the condition they describe is mythic, with no foundation in the facts of contemporary American life. Real men have no war offices, no situation rooms, no battle plans against women. There is no radical militant wing of a masculinist movement. To the extent one can speak of it as a gender war, it is the new feminists themselves who are waging it. And, I think I said this in the previous video. It's a gendercide, really. In order for there to be a war, there has to be two sides to fight a war. There isn't. For instance, A Voice for Men is seen as radical, but it's not. If you compare it to the radical feminist, it's not radical at all. It's moderate, and it's only because it is on the male side that it's seen as radical. In chapter 3, she talks about how gender feminists have hijacked universities, trying to change the liberal universities curriculum away from from so-called masculine domination. There is also a revisionism. Textbooks are giving women more space despite not being as important actors in history as men. And I quote, "In the same textbook, Maria Mitchell, a 19th century astronomer who discovered a comet, gets far more attention than Albert Einstein. In another popular high school text, there are 3 pictures of Civil War nurses, but none of General Sherman or General Grant." Also, because women haven't done enough historically to justify the 30% of textbooks being devoted by quota to women, much is avoided what Somers describes as philofeminism, much of which she says is inaccurate. What is more is that these texts, women's reproductive role or romantic urges such as Jane Austen, was repressed in these texts, and I quote again. A 1989 study entitled "What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Know?" by Diane Ravitch and Chester Finn determined that more high school students recognized the name of Harriet Tubman, 83%, than Winston Churchill, 78%, or Joseph Stalin, 53%. In fact, more knew about Miss Tubman than they knew about Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, 68%, or that the Constitution divides powers between the states and the federal government, 43%. 77% recognized that women worked in factories during World War II, but fewer could identify the Great Depression at 75%, or find France on a map at 65%. All knew that the Renaissance was characterized by cultural and technological advances at 39%. In the fall of 1992, Dr. Frank Lutz, a fellow at the Harvard University Institute of Politics, surveyed Ivy League students to find out how much history and civics they knew. His survey of 3,119 of our nation's brightest and best 62 educated students revealed that 3 out of 4 did not know that Thomas Jefferson had authored the opening words of the Declaration of Independence. Most, 3 out of 4, were unable to name 4 Supreme Court justices, nor could they name the US senators from their home states. More than a third could not name the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Such consequences are typical and predictable when teachers are distracted by the material they should be teaching by the effort to be ideologically correct. This, in my opinion, is why we need gender education, segregation, and curriculums, so that feminists can ruin their own gender and leave the boys alone, basically. That's just my opinion. She concludes this chapter with a feminist critique of scientific methods. I won't go into too much detail about that. Chapter 4 talks about how the original equity feminists didn't want to disregard male literature to suit our female history. This was a pretty dull chapter, to be honest. In chapter 5, I've got a quote here. We get a good idea of what students experience in the feminist classroom by looking at a model introductory women's studies course developed by 12 Rutgers university professors. One of the stated goals of the course is to, quote, challenge and change the social institutions and practices that create and perpetuate systems of oppression. 40% of the students' grade is to come from 1. Performing some outrageous and liberating acts outside of class, and then sharing feelings and reactions with the class. 2. Keeping a journal of narratives of personal experience, expressions of emotion, dream accounts, poetry, doodles, etc. And 3. Forming small in-class consciousness and raising groups. The feminist classroom does little to prepare students to cope with the world of work and culture. It is an embarrassing scandal that, in the name of feminism, young women in our colleges and universities are taking courses in feminist classrooms that subject them to a lot of bad prose, psychobabble, and new age nonsense. In the feminist classroom, students encounter committed teachers eager to interpret the lives, the societies, the intellectual heritage for them in no uncertain terms. Here, for example, is how Professor Joyce Trebilcock of Washington University in St. Louis sees their primarily pedagogical duty. If the classroom situation is very heteropatriarchal, a large beginning of a class of 50 or 60 students, say with few feminist students, I am likely to define my task as largely one of recruitment, of persuading students that women are oppressed. I will continue from chapter 7 in part 2.